My name is Mark Lubell. I'm a professor in environmental science and policy here at UC Davis. I've been here since 2002. I'm still the same age though, so it's weird. And I'm a social scientist who studies human decision-making and cooperation problems in the context of the environment. We're talking about working lands and people today at this panel. So, working lands, I think of them as, in the context of agriculture, at least agricultural lands that are working in the sense that they're agriculturally productive, economically viable, but also starting to bring in environmental issues of various sorts. Call it sustainable agriculture if you want. Talk about agricultural resilience in the face of climate change. So we'll talk about that. And we have two speakers to start out with giving some lightning talks, Majdi and Rachel. And then we have Majdi and Emily. And then we have a panel of distinguished professors who have worked on these sorts of issues over the years, and I will be moderating that. So with no further ado, Majdi, would you like to come up and talk about your work? He works on physical and biochemical processes, come on up, related to carbon, water, and energy. But my favorite thing when I was looking at his website is he talked about the complexities of natural systems and the mysteries of human decision-making processes. So he calls it mysteries. I do social science work, so I try to think about uncovering the mysteries, but I'm glad you appreciate it. It's a difficult task.
Thank you, Mark.
So.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Majdi Abou Najm. I'm a faculty at the Department of Land, Air, and Water Resources at UC Davis. I'm also the PI or director of the Awesome Lab. Awesome is both an adjective and an acronym. I mean, I have an awesome lab, and that's a fact. But Awesome is also air, water, energy, and soil optimization and management. And today I'm going to talk about harvesting the sun for both food and energy. If you haven't heard the term agrivoltaics, this is where I'm going to lead you today. Before that, I'm going to talk about the humanity's most important invention. And to my surprise, it's not the AC or the air conditioner, it's actually agriculture. Agriculture is what transformed us from hunters-gatherers 5,000 to 6,000 years ago or more. We started building our cities around fertile soils and water resources, and we transformed into what we are today. Since then, agriculture has seen multiple revolutions, and in each one of them, we've seen really a major spur in growth and productivity. First one happened at around the same time of the Industrial Revolution. Automation came and lots of research, and then the technology revolution arrived. We started building sensors, trying to learn more about the demands of our crops and how our land is doing. And then the communication revolution started, and this is where things started to get really interesting. You can, from your cell phone, see how your field is doing. By a press of a button, start irrigating. By a press of another one, stop everything. And that's the fourth revolution. Also, the most important equation probably in our life is written here. And I'm sorry about some of the format that got messed up transitioning the slide. But this is probably the most important equation for our survival. And throughout those four different revolutions, we studied and analyzed each one of those components of this equation and tried to perfect it and make it more and more efficient. I'm going to stop at the word efficient at some point in time and talk to you about lots of misconceptions about it. But for now, it's a good word. One thing that remained constant across all those revolutions is one term in this one, which is the sun. In our science community, we call the sun a boundary condition, meaning if it's too hot, evapotranspiration demand is higher, we just irrigate more, and that's how we deal with the sun. Too little, probably not too good for agriculture. You start looking for north-facing, south-facing, and you start optimizing for where is the best place to do agriculture. What I'm trying to pitch today is a potential for a fifth revolution where we can see the sun as a resource rather than a boundary condition. and where we start to recognize that if we have too much sun, that's not an additional cost of water, but probably a potential for creating renewable energies, while improving a microclimate that might save the amount of water we would want to put to our crops, and with that, potentially produce more food with less water. So thus, the term agrivoltaics. And agrivoltaics is a new technology that evolved probably about 15 years ago, and it basically tries to integrate agriculture and energy together. And this is the idea. So you put solar panels elevated at a height or distance that allows for automized agriculture to continue to flourish. My last point before I show you very quickly a couple of photos and end is efficiency. We've trained our minds for 100%. That's a good number, right? I'll show you that this is actually a very low one. Let's say you have 2 hectares or 2 hectares of land. You want to diversify. You would put 1 hectare of wheat, tomato, or whatever crop you're doing, another with solar panels. You optimize each one to the max. You get your best yields. You're 100% efficient, right? Look at the other alternative. Just put 50% density panels, put wheat under, or tomato. Let's say those are conservative crops. Your yields drop by 20%, so you're 80% efficient. Add 80% plus 50, you're 130% efficient on both crops. So numbers from the literature show that with agrivoltaics, there is a lot of potential for increasing our working land efficiencies. These are pictures from some of the experiments we're doing. We're testing different crops and how they react to different types of shade and light treatment. This is from last year's experiment where I tested with basil, tomatoes, and peppers. We're running a similar experiment today. We're testing also different configuration of solar panels, vertical and tilted, and we're testing how different coloration and different filters would react to that. And I don't know why I'm stuck in a loop. Oh, okay, that's my last slide. In addition to this work, we're also working on the next generation of agrivoltaics. It's funny because we haven't even built the first generation agrivoltaics yet, but my group is also experimenting with a new technology that can be big enough to an extent that I can call it agrivoltaics 2.0. I'm going to stop here, and thank you so much.
All right, Majdi, thank you very much. I'm sorry you were stuck in a loop. Professors tend to do that a lot. We get stuck in loops. Breaking out of the loops is actually one of the keys for sustaining working lands and lurking lands. So we will get there. Emily Schlickman in Department of Human Ecology is our next speaker. She works on design in a number of different ways, and she's also written a very interesting book recently on the future of fire and in California, and I guess the West more broadly. So thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Schlickman, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Human Ecology. And my focus is in landscape architecture and environmental design, and it's really an honor to be able to share some of my work with you all. So for the past, I've been at Davis since 2019, and since then my focus has been on the topic of fire and how we can bolster resilience in fire-prone areas across the state and the larger West. So I wanted to start by kind of contextualizing the wildfire issue. A lot of people come to me and say, why are we having these catastrophic fires year after year? And we tend to point to 3 big drivers that I wanted to unpack here. The first being climate change. We're experiencing hotter, windier, drier conditions, and our landscapes are really shifting. So you can see, maybe you can see, it's a little dark, but on the left is an aerial of a forested area in the Sierra Nevada range about 15 years ago, and on the right, that is what it looks like today. A lot of our landscapes are really shifting as a result of climate change. On top of that, we have the effects of colonization, the effects of changing landscape management and changing fire regimes. I'm sure you've all been here. This is the Valley of Yosemite. On the left is what the valley used to look like. This image was taken in 1890, a few decades after colonization. It used to have many meadows. It used to be really patchy. And this is because of thousands of years of care. And this is what the landscape looks like today on the right. And this is pretty emblematic of many parts of the Sierra Nevada range. We simply have more fuel in our forests as a result of actually suppressing some of these traditional landscape management techniques, including fire. Then we have growth into wildlands and working lands in this region. So this is a map of California, tilted, sorry. And the black is showing the wildland-urban interface, or what we call the WUI. It's a fun acronym. And this is a place of growth. People are moving here. And this is an overlay of historic fire perimeters. And you can see there's an obvious spatial correlation between the two. As more and more people move into wildlands, it increases the risk of ignition. It also puts more homes and more people at risk. So my colleague, Brett Milligan, and I came together a couple years back after I first started, and we thought, what can we do as spatial designers, as planners? How can we address this issue of wildfire in California? And so we published this book recently called Design by Fire, Resistance, Co-Creation, and Retreat in the Pyrocene. And a big portion of the book is reviewing case studies from around the world in fire-prone locations. So we looked at California, obviously, the Mediterranean Basin, South Africa, Australia, and Chile. And we looked at what are communities already doing spatially, right, to bolster resilience. And so we came up with these 27 different case studies. They all have fun names. My favorite one is called Fire Flocking. You can probably guess what that one is about. But what I realized in going through these case studies is that 4 out of the 27 actually use fire to fight fire. And I debated putting this slide in here, so I apologize. But about a year ago, I started training to become a wildland firefighter, and I got my certification recently. And I have been focusing my efforts on putting good fire down with communities in the region, not only to reduce the impact of future fires, but to have a whole range of co-benefits, social, ecological, cultural. And I'm on an Indigenous-led fire crew in Lake County, which has been really, really inspiring. Part of my work also is working with communities to kind of shift perceptions about fire. And we've borrowed from campaigns in the past a little bit. So instead of Rosie the Riveter, we're thinking about elevating Bonnie the Burner. You might have seen Bernie the Bobcat on I-80. That was my fault. So we're introducing what we're calling pyrophilic critters that challenge Smokey's notion that all fire is bad, which hasn't changed for 80 years. So we have Bernie the Bobcat, along with a whole host of other critters. And then also thinking about where our public lands are really succeeding at these fire management, really forward-thinking fire management techniques. How can we really celebrate them? So I'll end with that, but if any of you all want to talk about fire, I would love to chat more with you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have a panelist of faculty members and also Eric Holst from the Environmental Defense Fund is the first one here on my right. So he is a former UC Davis student, correct? Yeah, who is working with an important environmental NGO on these sorts of working lands issues. They're going to introduce themselves, and then I'm going to run through a series of questions that we discussed previously. And so why don't we go ahead and start with that? So Eric, go ahead.
Hold it down? I think so. Okay, hold it.
Yeah, keep holding it.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yes.
Eric Holst. I'm Associate Vice President for Natural Climate Solutions at Environmental Defense Fund, and I'm based in Sacramento. And as Mark mentioned, I'm a 1990 alum of College of Agriculture, I think one of the last botany majors in UC Davis history. And yeah, really pleased to be here. I work on wildfire resilience, so I was really excited to hear Emily's work. I've also worked kind of a jack of all trades, worked on agricultural issues, biodiversity conservation, and a whole range of things. So well trained by UC Davis, thank you.
Hi, I'm Valerie Eviner. I'm a professor in the Department of Plant Sciences, and my specialty is in ecosystem management and restoration, and particularly my focus is understanding how ecosystems function, and thinking particularly under changing conditions, some of the things that we've taken for granted of what keeps ecosystems going, we just haven't noticed that they were important because they were just running in the background. And now with lots of climate change, with suppression of management, we are seeing that there are certain key building blocks of resilience that are breaking down in the system. So it's things like our wildflower seed bank. They only pop up now and then, but we're seeing a decline in them. And when they're not there, we're seeing drastic changes in the ability of systems to recover from fires and droughts, right? Those are emergency first responders. Similarly, things like soil carbon, not just for carbon sequestration, but it's what gets water into the soil and what holds water into the soil. So it's critical for drought resilience. And so what we're doing is understanding how different climate changes and how different shifts in disturbance regime are influencing those building blocks of resilience, but then particularly with what Emily was saying, the idea that putting a fence around things to conserve things isn't what's working. We have to actively steward these landscapes. We have to actively get good burns in. We have to actively get prescribed grazing into our grasslands to be able to keep these building blocks of resilience going.
Hi, I'm Joanne Emerson. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Plant Pathology. And a number of my colleagues in plant pathology, and you've heard from today already, do incredible applied research on plant pathogens and sort of mitigating issues that are present today. And I'm going to go take a note from the program here and say part of why I think I'm here and part of my perspective is for pioneering answers for issues we have yet to foresee or encounter. So I come much more from the basic science side of trying to understand how the world works in ways that we don't know yet. And so very specifically, I work on the soil microbiome. And so I work on actually viral communities in soil. So these are viruses that infect bacteria. We know that bacteria can be important for biogeochemical cycling, for example, carbon sequestration. But we know very little about how the viruses that infect those bacteria might be impacting these ecosystems. And so this is something that, it's a very new field. We've only just started to have the techniques to do any exploration in the last few years. And so, yeah, I bring the perspective of trying to figure out what new stuff means, how the world works, and hopefully that will be a solution to problems that we don't know exist yet.
Hi, my name is Rachel Vannette, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Entomology and Nematology. And research in my lab focuses on basically these microbial communities that we think about as environmental microbes. So the bacteria and the fungi that are in the soil or live on plants. And our lab is trying to understand how these bacteria or fungi affect how plants grow, or why insects visit particular plants, or how insects vector some of these bacteria or fungi from plant to plant. And a lot of our work has been done in agricultural systems, but increasingly more of our work is happening in natural areas. These you see natural reserves or more areas that are not under intensive agricultural management. And hopefully I'll get a chance to talk a little bit about our work in both of those systems and how I think they're connected and sort of inform each other.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. My name is John Eadie. I'm a professor in the Department of Wildlife, Fish, and Conservation Biology. About to be an extinguished professor at the end of the summer. I'm retiring. I'm also the holder of the Dennis G. Raveling Endowed Professorship in Waterfowl Biology. So as you may gather from that title, I'm an avian ecologist, or a bird nerd, as my students refer to me. But so, yeah, my research is really a combination of basic and applied. On the basic side, My students and I sort of address a number of ecological questions related to population dynamics, survival and reproduction of particularly water bird populations, physiology, bioenergetics, genetics, all the way up to the dynamics of whole communities. But on the applied side, I've been working for the last 30 years really to bring some of this basic knowledge into the working landscape, and we've worked really closely with a number of agricultural commodities, particularly the rice community, and studies looking at both the conservation value as well as the agronomic benefits of providing habitat for waterfowl and water birds in the rice-growing region of California, establishing acreage goals for wetland conservation throughout California, and also looking at management techniques to try to maximize the value and the productivity and the conservation value of the existing wetlands. So rather than just adding more, as we're always inclined to do, thinking about what we can do more with what we have and developing management techniques to try to do that. And in addition to looking at various studies to investigate factors that are limiting the productivity or survival of several of our breeding waterfowl populations. So kind of the core underpinning of all of that is trying to bring basic avian ecology to use in application on working lands in the agricultural landscape.
All right, thank you all. And just preview that there will be a period of time for a question and answer here for both the first speakers and the panelists once we get through a few questions. I'm going to ask a few brief questions with some people to take the lead here on each question, and then the rest of you can chime in as you wish. So when you're talking about working lands, you're talking about the intersection between natural systems of various sorts, soil systems, fire regimes, and the people that are using those lands. That's required, that sort of science and knowledge is required to make that link. So maybe we can start with John. I was at a soccer game the other day. Somebody knew John, and they said, "Oh, that's Dr. Duck." So he's like, that's the first. That's the first lesson. Is good. You have a nice pithy name and for good science communication. But John, why don't you tell us about your experience in connecting the natural system to the social system in your work?
Thanks, Mark. Yes, I'm a ductor, I guess. My actual grandkids, I've got 2 grandsons, and my grandfather's name is Ducky. God knows why. So I'll give you an example. I've worked, actually, since I came to Davis in 1996, I've worked really closely with the rice industry. The story I'm going to tell you, you probably are all familiar with. It's been in the news, but I think it's worth retelling because it really illustrates working lands and what we're here to try to do. So, you know all the statistics. California's lost 90% of our wetlands. We've lost 98% of our riparian habitats. Doom scrolling, I guess, as Secretary Wakefield would tell us. And those wetlands are absolutely critical for millions of migratory waterfowl, water birds, shorebirds, as well as breeding and wintering habitat. Much of that loss has come because of agriculture. I grew up in a farm in British Columbia, Canada, and so I'm not knocking farming. I know how hard it is to keep farming viable, and we need to grow food for the nation and the world. But the question that sort of I've been addressing in my research for the last 30 years is really how do we try to do that in a sustainable way that's good for both people, for wildlife, and for the environment. So that's been a big focus. Something we often refer to as reconciliation ecology. So really, how do we, sustain biodiversity in places where people work, live, and play? So it's not an either or, it's both. So traditionally with rice, it was thought to be not a very environmentally friendly crop, environmentally beneficial. It uses a lot of water in what Mark Reisner referred to as the Cadillac Desert. It also is mostly on hydric soils. It's an aquatic plant. And so a lot of those wetlands that have been lost, in part, have come to agricultural crops like rice. So for a number of years before I got here, rice and wetland conservation were viewed as being in conflict. And that has changed dramatically in the last 30 years. And part of that is the work that we've done here at UC Davis, not just me, folks in LAWR, with the rice industry, with state and federal agencies. So you may know that back in the 1980s and so, rice growers would have to burn the rice straw to get rid of the residual straw at the end of the year. And that caused huge amounts of smoke and health concerns. And the Rice Straw Reduction Burning Act in 1991 restricted that. So that left growers with a real conundrum. How do you get rid of that rice straw? And so that was really where this idea of reconciliation ecology comes in, is that then with a variety of partners, the idea was, well, maybe you could flood these wetlands after harvest, and that would help with the rice straw decomposition. And the result was absolutely magical. All of a sudden, these wetlands, or these rice fields that used to be wetlands, came back as surrogate wetlands, and the birds came back. There were hundreds of thousands of birds that were now being supported on these wetlands. And there was waste grain that was left over from these crops that we've estimated probably provides 50% of the nutritional food that the birds need during winter. So it really was, quite an incredible system. But that felt good, but was there real value? So a large part of the work that we've been involved in the last several decades is actually looking at the agronomic costs and benefits to the growers, the wildlife value to the birds. We're looking at different ways of sustaining different practices, the changing agricultural post-harvest treatments that could affect the value of that, and now we're actually into a larger scale, sort of big-scale conservation planning effort to really integrate the economic benefits, the environmental benefits, but also the potential costs of different agricultural and agronomic practices involving complex computer modeling, lots of field studies, et cetera. So, I don't mean to be promoting any particular industry or group, but it really is sort of, I think, a great example of a reconciled ecosystem where there's win-win opportunities. That's a word that's used a lot. It's kind of cliche, but I think it is a case where there can be benefits to growers and benefits to birds. What's good for the grower is good for the goose. So we've done a lot of that, and now we're expanding with new work. Dr. Danny Karp is here, looking at other potential benefits. For example, there's a lot of work now looking at how fish could be grown in these rice fields, or food could be grown for fish in these rice fields, ways of getting sort of additional mutual benefits. There are some serious challenges. Water is a big issue, continuing water. What happens if we lose that flooded rice? That's providing half the habitat for waterfowl and wetland birds in California. Changing agricultural practices and crop values is all going to be a factor. And now even growers are starting to look at other practices besides flooding. So we could lose half of the wetland habitat that we currently have for winter. And the way we address that is primarily through our ongoing research. I think that's the value of the Ag Experiment Station, and it's going to continue. So I think there's opportunities there for win-win solutions, but it doesn't mean like you just do something and it's great and you walk away. There's always going to be changes. You have to do research to address those changes. And I think that's, one example of how we've been able to achieve benefits both for growers as well as for the environment.
All right, thank you very much, John. So you bring up this idea of reconciliation ecology. That's what National Science Foundation would call a great example of the need for convergence research, bringing together research from multiple disciplines in partnership with various interested parties to make it happen. So, Joanne, you're more at the side, more of kind of the basic research side of things. So how do you start thinking about that when you're, doing very basic research in some cases and thinking about eventually you want to translate that into the context of working lands? How do you start thinking about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we really want to ensure that we're doing is engaging stakeholders. So for example, growers on agricultural farms, to make sure that the basic research that we're doing is aligned with their interests. And so something that they're really interested in is the soil microbiome and soil health, and facilitating healthy soils, not just for this growing season, but to have sustainable farms in perpetuity. And so just to talk a little bit about the soil microbiome, something that is probably a little bit more familiar is the human microbiome, right? So obviously if we have a pathogen, we're sick, that's something that's an issue in the human microbiome. It's the same thing for a soil or plant microbiome. If there's a pathogen that can infect the plant, that might be one obvious example of a soil that's quote unquote unhealthy. But just like with the previous panel actually talking about, healthy foods and healthy communities, communities. I love that there was a question about that because that's really, it's much harder to define what is health apart from, say, the absence of disease. That's not a satisfying thing that we can look for easily or try to achieve. So essentially, what some of our research is doing is trying to figure out what is the range of baseline microbiomes across ecosystems. So these would be, of course, in agricultural systems, but also in natural soils, and what are some of the differences between the two. So as one small example, in some agricultural systems, you have tilling, and so that's mixing the soil, that's going to be mixing your microbiome. So on top of tilling, you also have some homogeneity of, let's say you have a monoculture crop, you have some management that you're applying, you have the same irrigation, maybe you have the same kind of fertilizer, organic, conventional, or otherwise. And so there's this mixing and homogeneity in agricultural microbiomes in the soil that we don't see as much in natural systems. And so sort of the question of, when you see a great diversity of the microbes that you find here and the microbes that you find here, quite literally that distance, you see huge differences in natural systems, but you don't see those differences in agricultural systems. What, if anything, does that mean? Is that a hallmark of something that's unhealthy? What does that continuum look like? So that's something that we're trying to understand. And I found it, I in my head kind of thought that this might be something that, growers might be like vaguely interested in, but they would want a solution today for the problems today. Understandable, of course they do. But I went to EcoFarm. It's an organic grower conference in Asilomar on the California coast. Gorgeous spot, by the way. I know people go to various conferences out there. Oh, it's amazing. Go if you can. But anyway, so this was, we presented our research. I was expecting, in a room about this big, like 5 people to show up, but it was packed. And the growers told us just by, our presentation of some of the basic soil microbiology that we're learning, they said that was one of the more interesting parts of the conference. And so we started a partnership with a number of growers in California who want us to come to their farms. They understand that we don't know what the microbiome is about today. Not like we don't know anything at all, but we don't know the complexities. We certainly don't understand the interactions among different, what we would call trophic scales within the microbiome. So as Rachel mentioned, fungi, protists, viruses, bacteria, each person, if you're an academic, you probably specialize in one of those groups, maybe one of those organisms within one of those groups. So how on earth do these things all interact? The growers are super interested in that and have been helping us identify locations on their farms, crops that might be of interest, management practices that might be of interest for comparison so that we can really get a handle on what the baseline soil microbiome looks like and how that differs across all of these things so that eventually, hopefully, I don't know if this is like a decade from now or even on the timescale of my career, we can say something meaningful about what is a healthy soil microbiome and what are some of the management practices that you can do as a grower to help sustain your healthy soil microbiome to facilitate agricultural sustainability and healthy crops. So, yeah.
Awesome, thank you. So does any of the other panelists want to comment on this kind of intersection between social and natural systems that research may or may not apply for working lands? Or you ready to move on for the next question?
Can I add something?
Yeah, sure.
Great. Yeah, I wanted to mention that working lands are not necessarily just agricultural lands. So some of the natural areas that we have in this state we conserve them for their biological diversity, and these are huge resources, right? Biological resources, and one of our recent projects sort of highlights this value. So I'll just take a moment to tell you about it. So we're really interested in the microbiomes of bees, not necessarily honeybees, but the bees, some of the native bees that live in the ground. And we chose this one species of bee that nests out at Bodega Bay on a beautiful beach. It's a cool bee, but it's, not a particularly important bee agriculturally. It's sort of a novelty bee. And we wanted to look at the microbiome, a novel bee. Thank you. So we sequenced the microbiome, and we actually found some really interesting bacteria there. We found that those bees host a ton of streptomyces. Has anybody heard of streptomyces? Okay, yes. That's pretty weird to be associated with a bee. And we've noticed that this bee has a lot of fungi, it gets a lot of fungal infections, and streptomyces are notorious. They produce a lot of natural products. So they produce really interesting chemistry. We wanted to see, do these bacteria suppress fungi? So we put them on plates together. Yes, these streptomyces are super antifungal. So these bees are cultivating antifungal microbes in their microbiome. And we've just started to look at some of the chemistry of these streptomyces exudates and finding novel fungicides there. So I just wanted to emphasize sort of the importance of conserving some of these natural working landscapes that we might be able to find a lot of things that we weren't sort of expecting but could be really valuable in leveraging for agriculture or human health.
Awesome, thank you. So, you know, the work on soil is interesting. You know, some work that I'm doing right now, it's soon to be published, I think actually shows that if you do a bunch of grower surveys out there and the grower is willing to say that they know something about their soil, they don't always get it right relative to what the soils they actually have are, but if they're willing to say something about their soil and they express some interest in it, they also do more sustainable practices. So there is a connection between the knowledge and the behavior there and the knowledge that's being developed at the soil in terms of soil biogeochemistry. So, but all that knowledge and all that basic research and applied research is done at the university. It needs to be translated into decision making, into policy, for it to be effective in changing how our landscapes are managed, both natural and agricultural land. So Eric sits right at the interface of that, linking with university researchers to work on the programs that he's running. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you're linking knowledge to policy in your work.
Yeah, thanks. We used to have a program at Environmental Defense Fund called Working Lands, and we talked about it as these are the places that produce food, fiber, and energy the world over. And you know, when you really boil it down, those are some of the most important places on Earth. You know, I forget the exact order of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but it's basically water, food, shelter. So these things are at the core. They tend to be rural places, you know, with a little bit lower population density, and they tend to be forgotten, you know, oftentimes by policymakers, except some who focus on that all the time. Thank you, Karen. You know, Environmental Defense Fund is a science-based advocacy organization. We work at the interface of science and policy and practice and interface with the private sector. And, you know, we tend to take on, you know, many of the same questions that faculty at UC Davis do, which is, you know, and in this realm, you know, what do we do about climate change? How do we mitigate it? Secretary Crowfoot, you know, just after lunch was describing how California is putting natural lands to work to help solve climate change. And so that's been a theme. Wildlife has been another theme that we've worked on quite a bit. You know, water. I'm working on wildfire resilience now in forestry. But in every stage of my career, and at EDF, it's been 18 years, and you know, overall, it's been, you know, close to 30 years of working on these questions. You know, I've tried to take a humble approach, not thinking that we have the answers, and that often, you know, the first calls that you make when you're taking on a new issue is to, you know, researchers, folks that have been studying this. And in my case, either because of geography and familiarity, the first call tends to be to UC Davis, you know. So just as an example, and I haven't seen Valerie for years, but we, in around 2007 or 8, after California had passed climate legislation to sort of make it, you know, set state targets for climate mitigation, we were interested in whether California rangelands could be put to work to store carbon. There was some theories about how grass, you know, with its deep roots, especially native grasses, could push carbon deeper into the soil bank. And so that led us to partnering with another local NGO, the Center for Land-Based Learning, which some of you may know, to do a series of, we called them carbon breakfasts. And we invited ranchers to come and talk about their land and about climate change and about their fears of regulation that would come from that, and then the possibility that regulation could trigger market opportunities. One thing led to another, and within a matter of weeks, we were in dialogue with Valerie and some of her colleagues at Berkeley to talk about whether the science would support this idea that ranchers could help combat climate change. And yes, the answer is yes. It's actually very tricky. There's a lot of trade-offs. Valerie was looking, I think, at some of the biodiversity consequences of all this, but that's just one example. I mean, and I could talk for a long time about 6 or 8 other examples of where, you know, we've had, you know, key questions on wildlife, monarch butterfly conservation, for example, a few years ago at a seminar just, you know, within a stone's throw of here, organizing folks to understand what was going on with monarch and what we could do to combat that. And at the core of that work were key UC Davis faculty. So yeah, just, you know, really vital.
Just a little bit of follow-up, like if you had to pick one key ingredient that makes those 8 or 9 case studies work, that translation from knowledge to decision-making, what is the one key ingredient that you would pick?
That is a super tough question.
You can only choose one.
One. Well, look, yeah, really. Breakfast does not hurt. Food, like, honestly. That's how we got people to show up, because, you know, ranchers are far spread. And if you order, and we ordered from the Buckhorn Cafe in Winters, and I don't know, I think it kind of goes back to humility. You know, the comment that I made right off the bat. It's just basically humility, curiosity. Is that too, or is that part of the same concept? I don't know. I think there's
professors only know about curiosity. I don't know about the humility
right.
part. Yeah, we have some problems with that
right.
sometimes.
Yeah, I think diving into a question with some humility, recognizing that you don't know the answer up front, having the curiosity to explore that, and then just an openness to collaborate and find, you know, and I'm picking another. It's persistence, because it takes a long time sometimes to find the answers.
Yeah, thank you very much. So Valerie, you've had a ton of experience doing this sort of work too. You've done work at the SF Rex and the other outreach sort of facilities that we have within the system, and worked with a lot of growers. So tell us a little bit more about your work and how you're doing that knowledge transfer.
Yeah, so I think the most important thing of thinking about that is it's not knowledge transfer, right? It's collaboration in even figuring out what the questions are, how we address those questions, and how we interpret right, that information. And for me, what's been really fun is about working in the AES system is I had come here, actually, I'd come to Davis specifically for the AES mission. I was at, you know, a very cushy job at a research Ecology Institute, and they just kept being like, you don't have to do this applied stuff, right? And so I came here specifically not only because the AES mission embraces impact, but there's that recognition that we actually do much cooler, much more cutting edge science when we were doing it collaboratively for problem solving. Because we can get into our little nerdy hole on things sometimes, right? And when you are working with decision makers, whether they're policy makers or land managers, you constantly have to think about lots of different things at once. You constantly have to think about wet year versus dry year, fire coming, you know, through, not enough feed for my cattle, like, you know, whatever it is. And so you start thinking a lot bigger picture. You start thinking about the much harder questions, right? So not just, well, here's some general principles, but oh, this works here, but it doesn't work there. This used to work really well, but with changing climate, we're not seeing this work anymore, and we need a different kind of thing. So we're fundamentally rethinking what we know about our systems and how we implement that constantly. We're thinking across broader scales. These are all sort of the cutting edge of ecology that most folks don't do because it's hard, right? But when you're working in collaboration with decision makers, you have to, you know, be able to do this. And I tell my students all the time, what's really important in understanding science and our collaboration with partners is there's a misnomer in how we've viewed this in the past, right? That, like, the idea of knowledge transfer. It's not knowledge transfer. Essentially what we can do is provide data. Data without context is just numbers, right? It's completely meaningless. Like, to turn it into wisdom is what's really important. And that is like the boots on the ground, the ranchers that I work with that have been there for 40, you know, years or more, the policymakers who have to also deal with, you know, all the topics we talked about today, right? Air quality, feeding, you know, communities that are food insecure, all of these things. And so plugging into these collaborative relationships and projects with decision makers makes us think more about complex systems, right? Makes us think more about what are the different levers that we can do. And certainly from basic science, what my nerdy basic science has been able to do is say, oh, I actually understand why this doesn't work anymore and it used to work, right? I understand now that there's novel tools because there's mechanisms we didn't see before, but now with climate change or with increasing fire, we do see it. And so, I think that working both, so I've on the advisory board of the California Climate and Agriculture Network, and they're fantastic in terms of developing and putting forward legislation that deals with mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And that has constantly made me rethink about the scale I'm thinking, about, and the kinds of data and the kind of research that's missing, like the reason why the Air Resource Board can't put what Eric was saying, like, well, the rangeland stuff, it's possible, but it's tricky. It's like, we got to work on the data to provide, like, yes, it's tricky, but here's some wisdom, right? Here's the decision support tool. And so working in collaboration with the folks that make the decisions, I feel like has made my science actually way more interesting and not just impactful.
Awesome. So thank you very much. So Rachel, you've also actually, I think you just, Valerie, I think just maybe rewrote the vision statement for the system, collaborating to change knowledge into wisdom. So maybe we can write that down and put it on the website. I think that's a good idea. All right. So Rachel, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work and your collaborations to change knowledge into wisdom?
Yeah, I actually want to follow up on some themes that Val mentioned right now in terms of listening and also in terms of sort of scaling up sort of some of the questions that we typically really dig into. So in a few years back, we applied to work with the California Tomato Growers Association. Because we were super interested in how soil microbes influence plant health and plant interactions with pests. So when we went to the meeting, some of the growers actually approached us. They were from organic farms, and they said, it's sort of weird. We have an organic farm here, and our neighbors have a conventional farm, and our farm, the organic farm, doesn't have any of these pest problems that our neighbor has. What's going on? And we thought, well, this is a very cool system. Let's try and check this out. So we went to a number of organic farms in the area and sort of their conventional neighboring farms, so we could try and control for sort of variation in the underlying soil communities to try and understand, is there actually a difference in these plants that are growing on these different soil types? And we found, yeah, there's a pretty big difference. So we went to look and see if there was a difference in the underlying soil microbes that might be supporting this growth. And there's a huge difference. These plants growing in organic soils had very diverse microbiomes, lots of bacterial species and fungal species. And we thought, well, is this it? Is this what's explaining this difference? Like, how do soil microbes influence pest pressure above ground? So we took soils from each individual farm and sterilized them and basically tried to understand, is it the microbes themselves or is it something else? And through that series of experiments, we found that these organic cultivation techniques actually do promote soil biodiversity. That soil biodiversity makes plants grow bigger and actually be more strongly defended against some of these pests, especially aphids and plant hoppers that transmit diseases that are really important for tomatoes. And so we went back to the Tomato Growers Association and presented this information. And to a lot of growers, this totally made sense. They're like, oh, this really explains what we're seeing in the field. This is a mechanism behind it. And I think I'm not sure that it translated to a policy change, but certainly influenced the decision-making of a lot of these growers in terms of disease management and promoting some of these organic cultivation management practices.
Awesome, thank you. Does anybody else on the panel want to give some reflections on this particular issue, connecting science to policy?
So I just wanted to sort of echo a couple of things. One that Eric talked about with humility. I've worked with a lot of growers and partners, and really it's a willingness to listen and learn from them, not teach. You know, we kind of come in as academics and say, no, we've got all the expertise. And boy, we don't. I mean, these people have been working these lands for generations. And not only that, but sometimes they come up with things you would never have thought of. We're working on a research project now that the ranch manager said, I've got a different way to manage for mosquitoes in the summer. That's created new wetland habitat, and from that, we've started a whole new research program on that. I think my upbringing as on the farm kind of helped a little bit. It sort of lowered some of those barriers. But really was curiosity, willingness to listen, but also willingness to challenge. I think once you establish that validity, you can't just be a toady, but you're saying, well, this is great, but what about that? Maybe that would work. And then the second point, what Valerie talked about was it's not just about knowledge transfer. It really is about co-development of knowledge. I mean, I've learned so much from working with these people. And then there's knowledge sharing, and that establishes trust, it establishes validity in your own credentials, and it sure facilitates implementation. When you come up with something together that you've worked on, they're far more likely to implement it rather than you saying, hey, we did this study, this is what y'all should be doing, and it's like, not so sure. So I think those 2 points, the humility and co-development of knowledge, are just absolutely critical to making it work.
Go for it.
Yeah, that just made me think of one thing that I've seen time and time again that really helps, especially when you have, say, different, maybe opposing viewpoints coming together on some of the thorny issues, is the idea of challenging but respecting, right? And doing that balance. And what I've seen time and time again, where sometimes folks are coming at things from sort of different assumptions, and maybe their explanations don't sound right? But then I'm like, okay, what are you seeing that's making you say that? And all of a sudden, right, the conservation folks, the rancher folks, everybody's on the same page. We're like, yes, I see that, I know that. And so then together, maybe we reinterpret, right, what that might mean and say, okay, right, the reason why we're suggesting this is we think that what you're seeing on the ground is actually caused by this other thing than you think it is, right? But that boots on the ground, right, respecting the observations really helps bring folks together.
All right, awesome. So we've talked a lot about science and policy. One of the other missions of the university is to educate people, and that can be another pathway to impact, another pathway to collaborating for wisdom. Like I was recently the chair of the Environmental Policy and Management Master's Program here at UC Davis, and a couple of our key staff members are sitting right there. And you know, Eric mentioned proximity. We really capitalize on the proximity to Sacramento. Eric can, you know, I think you do even live in Davis and you live in Sac, but you don't have to get on an airplane. You don't have to, you know, come over here. And you know, we go to Sacramento and to the agencies and run into EPM students all the time, and that sort of proximity. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about, you know, how the educational mission supports these broader scientific and policy missions. And maybe Eric, we can start with you. You were a UC Davis student, so how do you travel from UC Davis to EDF?
Yeah, that's a great, and you know, EDF has about 1,000 staff now globally. And at one time I was trying to assemble the number of UC Davis alumni at EDF. And, you know, it's kind of a unique organization, but, you know, it was 10 or 12 that had some connection. So we got to work on that. Maybe we get a few more, but, and there's ones that I don't know. So there might've been more, but, yeah, I mean, not only was I, you know, educated at UC Davis, you know, we've hired, you know, I've hired students, you know, from Davis, and we've had interns. And so I think that's so vital because, you know, I hate to say it, but I guess I'm sort of closer to the end of my career now than the start. And, you know, thinking about, we haven't solved all the problems that I set out to solve, which is kind of frustrating. You know, they keep coming around, and we have to motivate, you know, a new generation to take up, you know, the solution set. So I think that's really important that Davis and allied, you know, kind of land-grant colleges are producing these problem solvers, you know, folks that approach the working landscape with, you know, the kinds of passion that we've talked about here. So I think that's really important. And I'll frankly also note that, like, you know, folks that are coming out of school now, they just have different perspectives than when I came out, and around social justice and around, traditional ecological knowledge that's been mentioned today. And that's been super valuable just to sort of, have that kind of turning the problem on the side and looking at it from a different perspective. I think that's really important.
Okay, awesome. Valerie, you've actually worked with some students to get them into the field and participate in the collaborative co-production process. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that, your experience doing that?
Yeah, so this is something that I think the College of the Ag and Environment, here at Davis is one of the world leaders in actual hands-on education, right? And that's so impactful for students. Just like Eric was saying, right, training people in problem solving, like going beyond the book and being like, ooh, I'm in the situation where there's some uncertainties, there's no clear right answer, there's definite wrong answers, right? And getting them used to that thinking and the collaborative work you do to take your best guess, right? But then do adaptive management, monitor, shift along the way is really, really critical. And it's very hard when typically science students are trained in, well, here's a textbook answer, and right, and jumping from that into a problem-solving career is really tough. And so we have a number of different types of classes that we bring students as part, right, of this process. So in my restoration ecology class, every year we adopt a local site that's in need of restoration. So this year we're working with the Solano Resource Conservation District on Solano Lake Park, which had gotten burned in 2020, right, and most of the trees are gone, and it's this big restoration conundrum. And so essentially the field work, we go out into the field, we monitor what's there, both in terms of problems and in terms of the cool native species we already have. They then bring that into the classroom and report it out to the whole class. The class, every single student becomes an expert on a different restoration goal, whether it's a species or ecosystem service. We take the lab data then and we come up with the restoration plan, right? And so students learn to work, right, with the wildlife folks, with the bird folks, with the water quality folks, right? And being like, ooh, okay, what worked for my invasive species, control is totally bad for the ground nesting bird. And so how do we adjust this, right? So it makes them part of that process. Another really other great example of this is the pandemic shutdown, right? Plus the 2020 widespread, fires. We actually took the opportunity to bring students in a seminar, and something that we normally do with our collaborators anyway. And so what we did was had a Zoom class, because that's all you could do, right? And I guess this was January 2021 at that point. And we had about 20 land managers across Northern California that had recently experienced wildfires. And they each took turns talking about, all right, what happened? What were the impacts they saw? What did they do? What worked and didn't work? What did they wish they had done, right? And then over the course of that course, we put together, here are the priority knowledge gaps. Here are the priority sort of rapid response restoration of practices, but also rapid response research projects that we need to do next time we had a fire. So sure enough, right, the next year, McLaughlin Reserve burned, and we're like, oh, all the land managers from last year, right, already said, like, this is what we need to know right after fire. Can we put native species in? And will those keep out like Medusa head and goat grass? So we're ready to go jump in there. And students were part of that whole process through a series, of classes. And so I think training them in that is really important in terms of their self-confidence. It's really important in terms of them learning. You don't have to always be the best at testing. There are really different skill sets. There are really different things that you're good at that are critical parts of that team that don't normally show up on your GPA. There's also been really great research showing that for underrepresented students, these hands-on field classes are actually one of the best retention mechanisms of getting those students active in to the profession. And so there's a lot of really good reasons why these kind of hands-on things that, again, our college is one of the few that do this really well, is really critical. And just one other thing, what Eric was saying, I can count I've been here 18 years. I can account at least 50 of my alumni students who are working in Northern California NGOs, for different land management agencies, for different state, agencies. And some of them, right, are old enough now that they are the leaders of some of these really cool projects and these really cool agencies. So these do have impacts.
All right, John, why don't you talk to us a little bit more about that? You hold an endowed chair, so that gives you some resources to help fund graduate students, both master's and PhD students. You've worked with many, many students. So talk to us about that link between education and impact, and maybe you can say a little bit about how investing in that from the university perspective actually pays off to the university in the long run by bringing lots of opportunities back to the university.
Thanks, Mike. Actually, I think Valerie already said it all. But it's another story, it's the same story, just from in a slightly different sector. So I think this is a hugely underappreciated part of the Ag Experiment Station mission. We focus so much on our research, but we're actually training the next generation in my area of, wetland and wildlife professionals. I had a query. I don't know how many of you are UCD alumni. How many people are UCD alumni in this room that are now in a position in a public or private sector area? Maybe just throw up your hands. Yeah, I thought I might be preaching to more of the choir, but at least we have the key vocalists. You all know the story. UC Davis is, I think, the #1, the College of Ag, #1 in agriculture in the world. Sometimes people put us at #2. You may not know that we're in the top 5 for ecology and environmental biology, so that's really important. And at the risk of a little bit of humble bragging, a few years back there was a peer-reviewed published publication reviewing all the wildlife programs in the United States, and WSAB came out #1. So, I sort of tell my students with an interest in these areas that there's not a better college to go to. From the conservation perspective, I also tell my students that, if you look at, I think of California as the emergency room of the ecological and conservation sciences. If something got broke, we probably broke it here first. However, I also tell them, if we found a way to fix it, we also probably found a way to fix it here first. So, if you want to go into environmental conservation triage, UC Davis is the place you ought to be. So that training is just, I think, is hugely important. And sort of speaking, Mark mentioned that I have an endowed chair, which has been a huge privilege. This was a chair that was established before I came by private individuals who had a concern about waterfowl and wetlands in California, the heart of the Central Valley, the heart of the Pacific Flyway, but in partnership with the public sector, with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, or Fish and Game. And it's that private-public partnership that's so effective. It's not just the private, it's not just the public, it's that partnership that's going to sustain working lands and sustain our conservation efforts. I think that was critical. And that actually was the first chair. I don't mean to be focusing just on that, but that was the first chair that was established in North America. There are now 10 additional programs that have followed that model throughout the rest of the states. There's now one in every important flyway throughout North America. So what do you get for that? Well, there's certainly resources, funding, but there's a support, there's a network that's established, it's inroads into agencies, into private entities that might not be speaking to us otherwise or might not share the same concerns. And so in terms of the training, and I'm about to retire, so I had to put together some of these statistics for my last endowed chair report. But so just to tally, and this is just an example to illustrate, not to brag, apparently there have been over 3,500 undergraduates who've been subjected to my courses in avian ecology, waterfowl and conservation, many of whom have gone on to graduate school or, as Valerie mentioned, into public or private sector employment. And over 60 graduate students have received their master's degrees and PhDs, and I did a tally, and 55 of those 60 are now employed in some sector, either public or private, working with wildlife conservation issues. That's a pretty good retention. And that's just an example. I think others in my department have similar statistics. So I just want to emphasize, we often focus on the research products of the Ag Experiment Station, but I think the training is so vital, the experiential training in particular. Valerie's absolutely correct that we excel at that. It's a huge opportunity, it's a huge responsibility, but I think it's something that perhaps has been undervalued. We are the training ground for the next generation of conservation biologists.
Awesome, thank you. Would anybody else in the panel like to add to the theme of education? And then after that, we'll open up to questions.
I'll be super brief because we've talked a little bit about the University of California natural reserves in some of these capacities. And I just want to give a huge plug for the natural reserves. They're an incredible resource for education, bringing students out into just about any kind of ecosystem that you can imagine. They have infrastructure for lab research on site. They have, Bodega Bay Marine Lab has an incredible conference facility that no matter what you do, you can just go out there and hang out right on the water. It's incredible. So I won't belabor it too much. And I wasn't here in the morning, I was teaching, so for all I know, there was already a plug, but just an incredible set of resources. Very grateful for that.
Awesome. Any last words from the panel? All right, so I would like to invite our other lightning speakers to come up here. There's one chair up here already, so okay. All right. So they'll stay in place. All right, so let's go with questions for the panelists or the lightning speakers. It looks like there's some people walking around with microphones, or you can come up, and so raise your hand and let's hear what you have to say. Yeah, if the question is when is happy hour, it's soon. I'll answer that now. So, there a hand up? Did I? Go ahead, right there.
I'll be quick as well, but could you give me an estimate on what it costs to do a soil microbiome analysis for, an experiment that you could publish on a conventional and organic tomato farm? So if there are growers out there that I'm working with and want to do this as part of, because I'm trying to integrate research into the grants that they're writing as well, so that they can kind of do this independent research, but we also want it to be published. And so just a financial question.
Yeah, I think there are a few labs out there where you can submit samples and they can get a full report back. I want to say maybe about $100 a sample-ish, maybe a little less. Okay, the prices are coming down. Yeah, Joanne may have some more updated numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, this is like, we won't go crazy, but it depends on how many samples you have, right? These are the kinds of things that you typically analyze on a, few hundred sample basis. So if you just want one sample, it's gonna be like a couple grand. But if you have a number of samples that you can put together, that cost will come down probably below $100. And then, there are whole suites of, levels of analysis that you can do. And so this is sort of, I don't want to call it quick and dirty. It's a valuable analysis, but no. I mean, okay, sorry. What I'm trying, there are analyses where you can get like we think this species is here at approximately this relative abundance, but it doesn't give you much more information than that, and that can be very valuable depending on what your question is. Probably in your case, you don't want this super crazy expensive analysis, but something that we're trying to figure out is when you do this super crazy expensive analysis that's like $250 or more per sample, how much added value is that going to give you? And we don't have a good answer to that question yet, but we're working on it. Yeah.
Okay, right there in the purple. And then I think, Karen, did you raise your hand there? Oh, Helene was gonna, sorry.
Well, I don't want to hold up the dean too much, so I'll keep it quick. Thank you all for your contributions and your work. It was really exciting to hear about. I'm a first-year PhD student in geography here, studying climate change's impacts on fruit and vegetable agriculture here in California. And Rachel, again, I'm bothering more people, keeping it on the soil microbiome folks, but I was really curious about your findings with the California Tomato Growers Association. And it seemed like there was really positive feedback and reception to organic systems have this really great impact on plants' growth and ability to fight off pests. But oftentimes in economic and policy funding circles, there's a real criticism of organic, saying organic's more expensive, it's not as productive, how are we going to feed people? And I'm curious if you heard any of those criticisms and how you see the balance between those.
Yeah, we definitely have. And one of my collaborators specifically has looked at some of these, basically the variation in organic yield across years. And we know that pest pressure can vary among years. We know that, drought impacts can vary among years. And actually what she found, you can look up work by Amélie Gaudin, she found that over the course of a number of years, organic farms seem to be quite resilient and on par with conventional farms, which were more variable year to year. And so I think that's a sort of a nice counter to that argument that there are some drawbacks to organic. And certainly there are trade-offs, but yeah. So I think that's what they're finding. Oh, excellent.
Awesome. I think we've got time for one more question, so I'm going to defer to my boss here, and Helene.
Okay, the boss has a question. There is a person in the audience who's probably too shy to ask this question. She's new and thinking about starting up a farm. And I know she's interested in organic, regenerative. What advice would you have for someone who's out looking for a farm to maybe purchase? And then how do you start and get the good soil health and all these things? What are the first things she should do? And then if you can't explain it in just a couple of minutes, I'll introduce you to her later.
All I would say is find a network of, there are some really amazing organic growers out there that really have their management practices down. And I learn a lot from them. I hope she can learn a lot from them in terms of, place-based management practices. And I'll let other folks chime in here too, but I'm not the expert here, they are, but these are really great, like the Tomato Growers Association, they have awesome recommendations for management practices.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. Find an organic grower or group of organic growers. That's where I would start.
I'll just add one thing, which is that there's a great resource here in the region in Woodland called the Center for Land-Based Learning, and they have a new farmer training program, and it's great. I just took a class there in welding, and welding is an important skill for farmers because things break. But anyway, so that's another resource that folks should know about, and in good ties here on campus.
All right, well, that's a great thing to close with. As a social scientist, I actually study social networks, and I know that social networks are one of the most important influences on decision-making and knowledge exchange and collaboration. And I know that all of these folks are deeply entwined in UC Davis's networks, and that's really a great resource going for everybody. So I'm done. I think this panel is done, and next. Thank you.